Hello and welcome everybody to Intentionally Act Live. Thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Enrico Imanalo, Chief of Learner Success at All Aces Inc. And today we're continuing to talk about metrics, data, and what to do with it. Last month we talked about what the data tells us about the experiences of women leaders and Black women in the workplace, as well as what opportunities that data represents. Part of our conversation was related to metrics, which is what we will be focusing on today. So measuring DEI is notoriously difficult. So why are we still so hung up on representation as our prime diversity metric? Last month, we took a look at what the numbers are telling us again about what's happening with women in the workplace, especially Black women. And so, when we're looking at representation this month, part of what we're digging into is why people kind of gravitate towards that. Um, so when something is unfamiliar, we know that people take the path of least resistance. And so, for example, if it's something that you can relate to with your five senses, representation seems like kind of an obvious choice. While representation does matter, it's not the entirety of what we're looking at in terms of diversity, especially if we want to change the policies that exist to support the advancement of underprivileged groups. So, how do we get the representation we need to create diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces while sidestepping the pitfalls? So, hopefully, by watching this episode with us today, we'll be able to create a greater understanding or a greater depth of understanding of the depth and the limitations of representation as a diversity metric and highlight some of the other opportunities to measure how our diversity efforts are progressing or not. It's a lot more than a numbers game. It's also about feelings and perceptions. And after all, what good is it if your organization is diverse but overrepresented by a disengaged, unfulfilled, and uninspired workforce? We know that when people are disengaged, the benefits of diversity become next to impossible to leverage for greater organizational and employee well being. So, with us today is project manager and facilitator at All Aces, Octavia Chambers. How are you, Octavia?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Rico. How are you doing?
Doing pretty well. It's been rainy in California, which I know is maybe not something to complain about given the state of haven't heard of any wildfires recently or anything, but it is nice to have the sun shining again. And hopefully this means that we're moving more fully into spring. But very glad to be here with you. I think it's been a while since we've been on together. And so just really looking forward to today's conversation.
Same.
Nice. So let's jump in here. If we're starting with the basics, when you hear people talking about representation as their primary diversity metric, what's your reaction and why?
Yeah. So the first thing that comes to mind is where is the representation? And so I think this is a point that Jennifer may have touched on in the last IALI. But where's that representation? Is it in the front line? Is it in the C-suite, the management level? Like, where is the representation that you're saying is supporting this diverse organization that you're leading? Um, Another thing I think about is, does the organization have an inclusive culture that supports their diverse staff and feeling like they belong and can grow? What does retention look like, particularly for Black women, or when we think about people of color as a whole? And when we think about retention, like, we're thinking about, what does the culture say about the organization? Do folks feel like they are valued? Do they feel like they're seen? Do they feel like they're heard? Do they feel like they have opportunities for growth?
Hmm.
And then, like, what does turnover look like? Like, are people leaving the organization? What are they saying in their exit interviews? Are they even choosing to participate in their exit interviews? Because that's also an indicator as well. There's other things around, the EEOC complaints. Like, how many or what are those EEOC complaints looking like for your organization? And there's also a cost there when we're talking about diversity and retention and turnover rates, because you're losing staff, you're having to replace institutional knowledge, you're having to hire, onboard, recruit, that training, that all comes at a cost. And so that immediate reaction when folks talk about, I have representation, we are doing so great in diversity. I'm like, okay, great, but what's really underneath that?
Yeah. So it sounds like part of the issue that people have, or one of the issues confronting people who are looking at data, is when we look at data, it's kind of a static snapshot, right, of an organization. But given some of the things that you were just outlining, if we are getting good data, then it allows us to look not just at like a single moment in time, but kind of helps us to trace some of the organizational dynamics, right?
Mhm.
So if we're looking at like where the representation is, right? So sometimes people might have the idea, oh, this is a diverse organization. That means that throughout the entire structure of the organization, it is diverse. This is not the case. There
Right.
are many organizations that identify or report that they have high levels of diversity, but that might be true at the very lowest ranks of the organization. In fact, it might be more diverse than many organizations at the lowest ranks, but at the highest ranks, it may still be very, very white.
Mhm.
Uh, I think also on that turnover piece, right? So if you've got a lot of people coming in and a lot of people leaving, is it diverse? I guess it could
Mhm.
be, but will it remain diverse for long? I guess is the underlying question in that. No?
Right. Yeah. And whenever you talk about like, if there's like this idea of replacing folks where you're like, oh well, we're a diverse organization regardless of our retention rates or turnover rates who we bring into the organization. That's also just equating folks to being like a number in that representation. And
Mhm.
so it's something for organizations to make sure that they're actually really considering.
Yeah, so I think part of what I'm hearing here is like if every single part of an organization is interchangeable, then really it's like what is the value of bringing diversity to that since people are going to be treated as parts and all the same anyway, right?
Yeah.
Then it becomes more of like, see, look at what we're doing rather than look at what we are doing with what we have. And I
Mhm.
think part of the diversity conversation is related to sustainability, right? And I feel like this point goes under the radar a lot. Like we're talking more about long-term solutions, longer lasting relationships. Because again, if we have that higher turnover and just like all this motion, like, are you even together long enough for the positive effects of diversity to affect that population? I don't know.
Right. Right, that's so true. And so many organizations have values around impact, innovation, which are things that are strengthened by diversity. And strengthened by diversity when folks are able to actually go through that forming, storming, norming process and building community, understanding differences, understanding strength, being able to work together in a way where folks are able to bring their voices to the table, their full expertise is valued. And if you're continuously churning employees in and out, you're not reaching your full potential as an organization. You're losing money, but you're also not living within your values. If you have a value around impact, this also pertains to the folks within the organization and the impact you're able to create through the diversity that you're bringing in the door. And if you think about innovation is strengthened by diversity, different backgrounds, experiences, and diversity also helps you not make as many missteps. So like those ads that run that you're like, ooh, if I just would have had a couple of people of color or a couple of women in that boardroom to make sure that they were helping support whatever was approved in this ad or this decision, we would not have made that misstep. We would not have had that lawsuit and we would not have lost all that money or harmed this community.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's so many lessons out there in the world that still remain unlearned from, unfortunately. So again, data is useful, but um, unless we are really leveraging the things that we can learn from data, then it's really just kind of another thing that organizations do because other organizations are doing it, which is kind of silly. But
Mhm.
so if we're thinking again about metrics here, right? So people that work with data a lot, they have to be very aware of bias, for example. One of the biases that they have to be really aware of is called anchoring bias, right? So, anchoring bias, for those who are unfamiliar, once again, that's like the first piece of data that you receive, you kind of gravitate towards that, so that could lead to other assumptions. For example, if the first Black person that you meet in your life is really nice to you, then your anchoring bias might be, in that situation, all Black people are really nice, whether or not that's actually the case. So this is a super powerful form of bias, actually. And we're thinking about this, like, for a lot of people, this means that when people think of quote unquote diversity, the tendency is to think of a couple categories, right? So Black people, of course, women, LGBTQIA plus people, and it tends to kind of stop around there. Like, I've definitely been in spaces as an Asian American person, and they'll start listing statistics, and it's like Black people, women, Latinx people, and I'll be there waiting. It's like, what about indigenous people? What about me? What about, like, um so if we're thinking about the spectrum of diversity, it's pretty broad, it's getting more complex every day. What does that really kind of like look like in your mind?
Yeah. So when I think about diversity, I think about all the visible and not visible unique characteristics that make us humans. And I think when organizations are talking about diversity, that's also the lens through which they need to be viewing it, because there's so much harm that can come to doing the work as well as folks engaging in the work, when we don't view diversity across the spectrum, because it creates space for folks to disconnect or disengage from the conversation. And then, sometimes when people see people are disengaged, disconnected, they're enraged by this diversity conversation because they don't feel like they're a part of it. Those people see those actions, those reactions and beliefs, and that sometimes leads to folks covering, which is basically a strategy folks use to downplay a stigmatized part of their identity, and the efforts people make to combat and minimize the potential negative effects of bias. And so now folks are in the space of where they're covering and they're disconnecting and they're disengaging from the conversation in a deeper way. And if you're into the hearts and minds approach, and that's not always for everyone, but getting into the space where folks are able to understand how this work benefits not only their Black colleague or their woman colleague or their LGBTQIA colleague, but it also benefits them as well, regardless of their background. We are all unique humans and individuals, characteristics that may have, just due to the intersectional identities that we hold, have experienced some level of oppression or have a relationship with someone that has. And so this work, it's impactful to all of us. It supports and helps all of us.
Yeah, I think that point is well taken. If we can't see ourselves in diversity work, then it's really hard to connect to that kind of abstract or sometimes even moral position of like, we should do diversity work because it's the right thing. And
Mhm.
like, intellectually, I can accept that, even if I don't see myself in that diversity work. But when it comes time to actually do the thing, it's a lot harder, because it's like, oh, I'm doing this for other people's benefit. I might not be doing it for my own. And certainly, I think that this is the situation that sometimes unwittingly white people end up in. And I think, it's, of course, it follows, like, yeah, we want to do things to help vulnerable populations, and so they might need extra on top of the regular thing. But if people are seeing that others are getting some help, some support, or even just being like, explicitly included into spaces, but that invitation is not being extended out to them, I mean, after a certain period of time, you really kind of start connecting dots for yourself. And it's like, oh, diversity is not for me, which,
Mhm.
huge problem, right? It's kind of like, I know your daughter is like a little bit too young to start reading, but I don't know if you remember that story from when we were kids. It's called Stone Soup. It's
Oh,
like,
no.
oh, okay. So the the nutshell version of this story, Stone Soup, is like there's a mom, and she's gonna make her famous soup, and then one by one, each of her family members comes up and is like, "Hey, I love the soup. Can you make it without this one thing that I in particular don't like?" And she's like, "Okay, okay." And then long story short, by the end of the book, they're sitting down to eat the soup, but there's like nothing in it, right? Because every single person has come up and said, "I don't like this one thing," and there's no more ingredients to the soup, right? So sometimes I see
Yeah.
diversity work as like the opposite of that, you know?
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, that's so real. And that's such a good point. Because I've been in organizations where I was leading the work and they were like, let's not talk about this because this will upset this, side of the business, or let's not bring this in because it's not necessarily relevant to our population, or let's not bring this in because, the organization is not ready for it. But then what does that leave us with when we're talking about our diversity work, right? When we're talking about equity and inclusion, water, right? Watered down, nothing, and no
Uh-huh.
progress, no movement, nothing to eat, nothing to nourish us, nothing to help sustain us or help us grow. And so I love that story. I'm gonna have to go back and get that so I can read it to little Zara.
But yeah, I mean, I think there's so many organizations that have spent a lot of time on their like diversity statement or their commitment to diversity
Mm,
thing on their website. But then you end up talking to the employees and they're like, yeah, so beyond that, we haven't really done very much. And I think sometimes it's because of that, you know? If people aren't willing to get into
yeah.
what's actually wrong, then it's gonna stay wrong. Um, so I think we just
Hmm.
mentioned intersectionality a little bit, and again, I know that we have to go over the definitions a little bit sometimes, or be reminded because intersectionality is a little bit tricky. So I think for today we have a slide to help us out with that a little bit, and let's see. So some of the categories that we're talking about for identity, of course, race, ethnicity, gender, religion, age, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, tribal, indigenous affiliation, body size type, health, mobility, education, culture, nationality, excuse me, language, and ability or disability. But this is not an exhaustive list, right? But even if we're just kind of like looking at any group of people, we can clearly see like there's a lot of intersections, there's a lot of differences. And so again, if we are not seeing ourselves somehow, then I think, these what these slides help us to see is like it's very easy to fall short.
Hmm. Very easy.
Yeah. So if we're thinking about like again, because we mentioned those visible characteristics, right? Why do I mean we gravitate towards the visible characteristics, but like what happens when we don't pay attention beyond just the visible, beyond the easy?
Yeah, because like you said, it's easy. It's easy to kind of look at someone and decide, what group they may belong to, which we shouldn't be doing, but what group they may belong to, or what they may need, or how they may operate in space. It's harder to take into consideration those underlying undercurrent things that make someone who they are. The family dynamics, the loss they may have experienced before walking in the door, the mental health issues that they may be navigating on the day-to-day basis. And it's often hard because people are in a space of covering because, society has stigmatized us, has made it sound like, it's not okay. Like, I feel like so many people struggle with depression and anxiety, me being one of them, but it's so stigmatized to say, I'm having a bad morning, a bad mental health morning, or I need to take a mental health day because we know that society deems that as a weakness and something that can eventually lead to harm in the workplace, whether it's, assignments being taken away from you, maybe your boss feeling like you're not as competent. And so it's easy to go after the visible things, but the non-visible things are the things that make each of us very unique, but they're the things that we are never able to like necessarily measure or ask about, because when we talk about the stigmatization in society, it it impacts all of us, right?
Mhm.
Because when we're talking about mental health, it doesn't matter what race you are, what ethnicity you are, what gender you are, like everyone can struggle with mental health. Their intersection identities may make it um, a different experience for you, right? Because you may also have some racial trauma that you're experiencing, trauma that you may experience as a woman that may be compounding that experience of the mental health. But these are things that connect us all to the conversation. And I
Mhm.
think because we're not necessarily measuring those, and because we're not asking about them, because they're so stigmatized in society, we're not able to really make that connection to the work for folks.
Absolutely. And what you were saying had me reflecting a little bit. Like, I know that between you and I, we've had conversations about mental health and with several other team members as well. But I'm thinking back to there was another team member of ours who, we'll keep the name private just, to keep things nice and neat here. But I was going through a lot, recent deaths in the family, and during a conversation where we ended up bringing mental health into what we were talking about, this person on our team was like, you know what, I've really been struggling, especially with what's been going on with my family member. I think I'm actually gonna try to reach out to a grief counselor.
Mm.
And that's the kind of thing that does not happen unless you are in conversation with people, unless you're being shown like, yeah, it's okay, this is a normal thing, this is something that people do,
Mhm.
it's not weird, there's no stigma attached. Like, sometimes that's all the like push that you need, just
Yeah.
the awareness that other people are doing it.
Mhm.
And I feel like sometimes workplaces are so task and role focused that we lose out on those human moments that
Yeah.
really can be transformative. Right. So
Mm.
there might be people who are listening who are thinking like, well, but going to see a grief counselor like one time probably won't change that person's life. That may be true. But if they start thinking about mental health in different terms, then, behavior will follow. And
Yeah.
any kind of behavioral change can have a big impact over time.
Yes. And it also leads to them having more compassion for someone else, more understanding, empathy, for someone else that may be going through something. Like leaning into that experience and understanding that that's okay provides space for pushing that transformative thinking forward.
Hmm. Yeah, and I definitely feel like, again, if we are in and out of organizations all the time, right? If there's massive turnover, then again, we have fewer opportunities to connect with one another on those human levels to get those kind of sparks going. And you were talking about innovation, right? So a lot of people have this innovation. The innovation is like fueled by innovation, and that's just a circle, right? So that doesn't follow. Part of what allows innovation to actually happen is you need some stability, right? Because if you don't have the stability, how are you going to feel you know stable enough to do the risky thing?
Yeah. And how are you going to, even if you're continuously starting at point A, because you have to continuously bring people in, you're never going to make it down to D, E, F, G. Like you're going to continuously stay in that same space. Like it takes time. You need stability across the team that you're working with, which comes with when we talk about like culture. What culture are you creating for your organization? Is it an inclusive culture, one where folks feel like they have a seat at the table and shared power and decision making, so that they can support that innovation and that movement? That's so interesting, that organizations that have this value, and I'm always stuck on values, that have these values where if you get down to what it looks like in practice, if we're operationalizing our mission, our vision, our values, diversity, equity, inclusion is foundational to all of it.
Hmm.
But there's like this disconnect for folks.
Right.
And so you either need to shift your values, or we need to dive into what this means for you and your organization.
Yeah, the way that you just framed that, it's foundational, right? So sometimes, like in my personal life, I'm an avid cook, but I'm not an avid baker. One of the reasons is that when I'm cooking something, if I make a mistake, I can like bend it back. If I'm baking something, once it's in the oven, it's gonna come out how it comes out. Because
Yeah.
like if I made a mistake at the beginning, I'm gonna be eating those results. And so
Mhm.
I think that's a difficult thing to contend with as an organization, right? Because there is an awareness out there that it is foundational, but we see so many clients trying to like layer diversity into their existing thing.
Yeah.
And part of the challenge is we can't, like as with a failed baking experiment, simply start from scratch, right? Like that
Mhm.
would be terrible on so many levels. But trying to weave diversity into your foundation from the outside in is, of course, just going to be super, super challenging.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree.
So when people, they have this tendency to believe that when they see a diversity of backgrounds or identities in an organization, like just that basic representation, again, that is diversity, right? And a
Mhm.
lot of people feel like that's unquestionable. To some extent, it's true as we've gone over, but as we've been talking about, diversity goes beyond the visible, right? So if we're thinking about just the limitations, purely about the limitations here, right? Why is it important for us to understand the limits of what we're measuring if we actually want to like leverage it for the greater good or for transformation?
Yeah, I think it's because it all goes back to what you're intending for the focus of diversity, equity, inclusion work, the focus of representation to be. Because if you're just focusing on diversity, for example, I was working in an organization and I had a colleague come to me, older white gentleman, and at this point we had relationship. I was intentional about building relationship across the organization, and he came to me and he was like, I don't trust this DEI work. And I was like, okay, say more.
Yeah.
Right. And, he told me the reason I don't trust this DEI work is because, like 20 years ago, um, he was applying for a job and he didn't get it. And the reason why the hiring manager told him he didn't get it is because of affirmative action and they had to hire a Black person.
That's so terrible.
Yeah. So if I'm seeing the humanity in the situation, I'm like, you know what? I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm sorry it was framed that way for you.
Yeah.
But, you know, but I was like, that's not what we're doing here. Because when we talk about, diversity in the organization, we're talking about, where are we posting our job ads? Are we posting them in spaces where we can get a diverse pool of candidates? Right. We're not trying to, he brought up, just trying to hire someone that's not necessarily qualified. Like, no, we're trying to look for candidates that are qualified, but we're trying to diversify our candidate pool. So where are we posting our jobs? What partnerships do we have with what universities? Are we reaching out to HBCUs versus the local colleges around our community, we live in a very white state. And so that is going to influence the candidates that we have if those are the only partnerships that we have, right? Are we
Hmm.
partnering with the local Latino network or, NAACP or Urban League on their job board and their job fairs? We're talking about like bringing diversity into the organization. That's what we're talking about. And he was like, oh, that makes sense. But if we're going back to that anchoring bias point where folks, they hear diversity, they hear this affirmative action framing that they may have gotten like 20 years ago, they hear, oh, you're just trying to bring, Black people or people of color into the organization, and they may not be qualified, and it's all just a numbers game. It's harmful. It's harmful to the people that are coming into the organizations, because that's how they're being viewed. It's harmful to the culture of the organization because they have no trust in the work that you're doing. They believe that it's Dr. Martin says this quote, and I may not say it right, but the privilege is it's invisible for folks because the lack of privilege is what makes it visible. And
Mm.
so for him in that situation, he was just now seeing that I had some privilege, some entitlements, some benefits, some unearned claim to space. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about diversity within organizations. How are we dismantling that that privilege, that unearned access and dominion over a space? And
Mhm.
when we're not leaning into an intention where we're trying to truly bring diversity in a way where we are valuing the whole human, and so not playing a numbers game, but also making sure that we're bringing in folks that are able to do the job, we're leading us down a road where we're causing harm to everyone that is involved in a situation, and we're harming the culture of the organization. I feel like I went on a tangent.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like part of what you're saying here is, for this gentleman, the way that I was hearing it is there's some expectation of like meritocracy, right?
Mhm.
But what many conversations around meritocracy don't take into account is the starting point of the players, so to speak. Right. So if we are all starting from the exact same spot and we have similar abilities and skills and experience, then generally we're going to say that's fair. It's presented to us in that way, but that's rarely ever the case, right? And so I think that that quote that you mentioned definitely makes sense in that context. But really, if we do want to get to a true meritocracy, and I think that there are a lot of people out there that are actually hungry for that, right? So it doesn't feel good to get things that you didn't deserve, right? So like
Mhm.
occasionally, like the other day, I found $20 in the parking lot. That felt pretty good.
Yeah, yeah, handsome.
But yeah, I'll take it. But if it's like, some job title where I'm supposed to be this highly competent, highly skilled person,
Yeah.
and then I'm not, like, and we all know it, honestly, I'm not going to feel great about that every single day because,
Mhm.
like, there are going to be others around me that are like, yeah, Rico has this position, but he doesn't know what he's doing.
Mhm.
I've only seen that really happen in workplaces like a couple of times. And I don't know if you've seen this happen, but the way I witnessed it, the people in those positions transitioned out fairly quickly, right?
Mhm.
Because it's like, if you're in this role that you're not qualified for, you're not going to succeed and you're not going to
Yeah.
get promoted, probably, hopefully.
No, that's very true. And then there's also this narrative, oh, well, we tried to bring in, a person of color and then they failed miserably. Okay, but you just tried to bring in a person of color. You weren't intentional about ensuring that you found the right person for the job, the person that was able to, bring the expertise and skill to the table, who was also a value add in the diversity of their background.
Hmm. Hmm. So if we're thinking again about like these kind of unseen diversity characteristics, right? So somebody watching might be wondering like, yeah, okay, I'm following along here, but how then do I even dig into those unseen things? Like how do I measure the unseen or the things that people may not want me to measure, you know?
Yeah. And that's hard. And I know we had a conversation about this because, we don't necessarily have culture where that facilitates folks feeling safe to elevate those things that are not visible. Like, I'm just going to volunteer my background, my quote unquote baggage, as society would see, so that you can look at me differently. Okay, no.
Right.
And so I feel like it starts with culture. And for some organization, I was just talking to a CEO, and And she was like, we just have all these, women of color come in and they just filter out so quickly. And I'm like, well, maybe you should focus on developing an inclusive culture. So that when folks come in, they come into a space where they feel safe, like they belong, like they're valued, like they're heard. And I think when you start to create spaces like that, that's when folks will feel comfortable elevating, hey, I, struggle with my mental health. You're able to collect data on that, or like, hey, I need support with housing, or hey, I need, like, all those different things, those things that people hide, sometimes they're ashamed of, those stigmatized identities, those start to come up with space whenever you have an inclusive culture, when you focus on relationship, when communication channels are open, folks
Mhm.
feel like they're heard, whenever there's safety in providing feedback. And like, that's something that's so key. And that is involved in an inclusive space. Folks are like, well, we have an inclusive culture. Okay, what's our culture of feedback as well? Like, are
Yeah.
folks able to elevate things and not feel like they're not going to be heard, or folks are going to be defensive or dismissed? Like, when all those things are coming together, then I feel like employers will be able to measure some of those things where, it's optional when you're filling out a job application.
Right.
And folks are like, I'm not answering that, I don't know you. People may be more inclined when they know that this is a safe place. Things aren't going to be used against you. We are using it because we really want to ensure that we are resourcing you in the way that leads to equal outcomes, so equity. And so I feel like first, like, it starts with developing an inclusive culture that leads to equity, and that really helps ensure that the diversity that you're bringing into the organization is able to stay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of spaces outside of the workplace that I've been in that have like really very inclusive cultures. And I'm thinking of a couple places. So like a friend of mine used to run a coffee shop that was also like an art space. And what was cool about it is you could tell that there were a lot of regular customers there. And not only that, but the regulars, they left their mark on the place as well, right? So they didn't own it, but my friend would be sure to be responsive to their needs. And so over
Mhm.
time, that loyal customer base grew, and increasingly decisions related to how the cafe was being run were going out to that group of people who really felt like it was their home. And I'm not gonna leave my impression on a place where I don't feel like I can put my feet up,
Mm.
you know?
That part, yes. Right. You're not gonna engage, you're not gonna give them your best, your innovative ideas if you don't feel like you can put your feet up. I love that, sorry.
Well, I mean, I think in many ways that is the point of like say ERGs, but honestly, when we go in and talk to organizations about ERGs, that is rarely ever the story that we get to hear from people, right?
Yeah. ERGs, it's always so interesting in the way that they're designed and the power that they have, and the spaces that they're allowed to create, if there is even safety in those spaces. And so it's very interesting. It's definitely a tool, but I think organizations need to be more intentional about the way that they are creating those groups. And like, to your point around the coffee shop, ensuring that they're including the employees that they're hoping to, like, are going to benefit or serve in that planning process, so that it's what they need, not
Mhm.
this whole, like, because I think the language shifted from like business resource groups to employee resource groups, because we're going to resource the employees. Okay, well, resource the employees, make sure that they're
Mhm.
a part of the planning process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like part of what we're talking about here is whether we know it or not, whether we intend it or not, it's really easy for dynamics to shift or elements to come into the situation that make people feel like they're being dehumanized. And when
Mm,
that happens, then there's a really strong disconnect, right?
yeah.
And part of that is like if I'm being treated as replaceable, as
Mm,
interchangeable, as some resource to have data extracted from and used for purposes that I may or may not agree with, that may or may not align with my personal goals or values, then it's like it's hard for me to see myself in this, because the me is getting pulled out of it against my will and against what I desire, you know?
Right. Nobody wants to be thought of as a number. And if the narrative in the organization was like, oh, one black woman out the door, they're just going to hire another one or bring another in to replace the three that just left. Like, that's not allowing anyone to show up as their best selves or to contribute to the organization in a meaningful way. And I feel like that's literally the approach that most organizations take when you talk about representation. You're talking about that number. And then whenever that number goes down, okay, let's just bring in another number versus looking at, well, why did the numbers go down? Let's talk about that. Let's problem solve for that. Let's review those exit interviews. Let's make some changes to our processes and policies without having to go through an EEOC process, so that we can ensure that we're creating a culture that allows us to not only sustain the folks we have, but bring more folks in. They're telling their friends that this is a great place to be.
Yeah. So if we're not like looking at this as like representation as the only lever for change, but as kind of like, and I hope it's clear that what we're talking about is it's not that we think that representation is a useless metric, but more that it needs to be connected with other things. It's part of how we look at the organization. It's not the entirety of how we look at it. So if we're kind of thinking as representation as one important metric among others, right? So if it's like this cereal as part of this complete breakfast, then for you, what are the other important diversity metrics that would kind of round that out?
Yeah. So just kind of digging into like the diet framework. And so like, what does communication look like across the organization? How do folks communicate with each other? Is there a conflict resolution structure? What does feedback look like? Um, Also like relationships. And so what do relationships look like across the organization, across levels, roles, departments, within your own teams and space? Is there space for collaboration, or are you working within silos, right? And so we're talking about relationship, communication. And there's also this piece around like, how are you seeking to learn about the experiences, the perspectives, the backgrounds of the employees that you're bringing into your space and the communities that you're serving, right? So how are you building your awareness, your skill set around ensuring that those folks feel supported, they feel seen? How are you getting to know them outside of pestering them with questions? How are you leveraging your Google skills? How are you bringing people, speakers into organizations to ensure that, folks are learning more about the folks that they are working with, and they are understanding the value and the background, diversity, and expertise that is within this space?
Oh, we have a comment that's come in. It's Miss Will 383. What kind of changes can people make when the people of color leave? Can you give some examples?
Wow, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
And so the first thing that's coming up for me is you would honestly, it varies by organization. And so when people of color leave, being able to ask them why.
Hmm.
So if that's through an exit interview, and sometimes folks, they always make the exit interview go through a certain person or be through a certain process. Provide space for folks to give feedback when they exit in a way that feels good for them, if you're really wanting to hear why someone is leaving the organization. If you are an organization that also has had some EEOC complaints against you, okay, look at those. What are those things that those folks have elevated? Because sometimes they're related to culture, sometimes they're related to management, and kind of shifting some things around policy and practice. For example, I was in an organization where a lot of women of color filtered out of the organization due to a management style.
Mm.
um, one of the main managers of that team, practiced a lot of favoritism, just didn't have some foundational management skill sets. And she was very defensive when folks would bring things up. People were put on pips without even knowing. And so, for an example for that organization was, okay, we're going to ensure that all of our managers, and this happened in another organization as well, all of our managers are trained in basic foundational management, like how to do check-ins, one-on-ones, how to support employees if they elevate. There's another organization I worked at, elevate a need for support, like going through an FMLA process. What are the steps to actually putting someone on a performance improvement plan? Like, what are the things that need to happen before you even get to that space? And so it's really about taking the feedback that you're getting from the folks that are leaving the organization, and then putting some action behind it. Okay, this was elevated. You can even also do like additional focus group with the remaining folks that are within the organization. You're saying, hey, we have recently had a lot of people of color leave the organization, and this is something that is a priority for us, because we have a value around ensuring that we not only have a diverse organization, but we have an inclusive culture. So we're providing, an open forum for folks to share, because people talk. They probably can tell you why that person left anyway, but
Mhm.
providing the space where folks can elevate those things so that you can get that feedback. Because honestly, the first thing that you would need is the feedback that's specific to what's going on in your organization.
Absolutely. And there are tools online that exist. For example, Glassdoor. I don't know how often
Mm-hmm.
organizations look at sites like Glassdoor, but when there are issues in an organization, people might not want to rock the boat. They might be afraid of retaliation. And so they might not be willing to, because they simply don't feel safe enough psychologically, or even, maybe physically. And so, what are your, excuse me, what are the opportunities that people have to be truthful with you, to be authentic with you? I think something else that came up for me as you were talking, Octavia, is this piece around management. So last time we were on, we were talking about how important managers are. They can have like, up to 70% of the variance in experience of people on work teams is directly due to their relationship with their manager. And that's huge, right? Because it's essentially management that is kind of the conduit through which the frontline workers tend to communicate or not with the
Mm-hmm.
C-suite, for example. So there's a lot that runs through managers, and we kind of sort of in the same way that we place a lot of expectations and responsibilities onto our teachers, we also place a lot of responsibility and things on our managers. Whether or not that's fair, I don't think we have the space to cover that in this conversation. But this is all just to say that making sure that managers have adequate training, adequate resources, adequate staff,
Mm-hmm.
adequate time to be good at what they do, super, super important, right? Um,
For sure.
but yeah, I think also because, well, gossip is actually something that I studied a little bit, and it's something that's protective and helpful for psychological safety, which is also part of the reason why people engage in it so much at work.
Mm-hmm.
But if you really want to get the real story on a lot of things that happen in the workplace, it pays to have a good connect to the internal gossip network, if there is one. There is one.
Yes. Follow the gossip. It will lead you there.
Spring for some long lunches, and some invest some time into your relationships, and it'll probably pay off.
Exactly, relationships. There we go. No, and as you were talking to, you made me think about a point that I think Jennifer brought up in your last session was around the frozen middle. And
Mhm.
to your point around, oftentimes we sometimes get feedback and an understanding of where or why something is happening from, folks that are not directly being impacted by, what's actually happening to get to that point. And so, and taking time to engage and get feedback across all levels of the organization is super important. And I love how you elevated, with managers, especially as well, because they, a lot of times folks don't necessarily leave organizations, they leave their managers. And so
Yeah.
ensuring that, managers are not only trained, I love that addition of ensuring that they are resourced, and that includes the time. And so we want them to be effective in their role. We want them to nourish and grow the organization so that we can reach innovation, so that we can have an impact. And so, how are we ensuring that we are supporting our managers to get us to those results?
Yeah, I've learned something about, I guess generosity is one way to put it, but it's the easiest to be kind and generous when your needs are taken care of. And I know
Mm,
that's like, that's intuitive. We all kind of know that. But if somebody is being pulled in a million directions by a million different people, then how can we expect them to be as responsive, as detail oriented, as thoughtful, as caring as we need them to be? It's just not realistic, right?
No, that's so real. I was in a role where I was managing two women of color, and it was a tricky dynamic and a really tricky organization. And it got to the point where, I was having those pulls and those tugs. And I was like, you know what? I am not going to be able to show up in a way that is going to benefit them. Um, and I was like, this is not going to be a good fit for me if this is how the organization is going to continue to run. And so it was time for me to exit that space. But that's so true. Like, even if you have this desire to show up in this way, to build this culture, to support employees in the way and resource them in the ways that they need, if you do not have the time, the resourcing to do that, you're not going to be able to. And so it's also up to the organization. It's not necessarily, it's the system, it's the organization, the institution, to make sure that those things are in place to support the positive outcomes for the managers as well as employees that they support.
Yeah, and again, this plugs back into some of those invisible diversity characteristics or dimensions that we were talking about, right? So we know that life is all about change and like things are changing all the time. And so if we're not checking in with people on an individual level, getting a picture of what's going on at the group level, then it's really easy to miss these kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
And for people to get disengaged along the way. So I think ultimately what we are advocating here for is like if you're gathering data without the relational context, then you're only going to be able to get so much. If you got great
Mhm.
relationships between different departments and different levels at your organization, then not only are you going to be able to gather a lot more data, it's going to be a lot more authentic. And also, you will be able to create a much more personal impact, not just for the individual, but for the organization overall. So
Mm.
hopefully that helps to reframe some of this conversation on representation because it can be so much more than what we're making of it. I think is the point I'm driving toward.
I love that, Rico.
So, any kind of final thoughts here as we're moving to close out?
Yeah, I just, for organizations that are really struggling, because it is a struggle, it's hard. This If this work was easy, then it'd be done right, right? But all the time, that for organizations that are struggling, kind of stick to those core foundational things. And so, like you did, the need to ensure that there is relationship, that there is communication channels, that there is an awareness and understanding, because having those three things baked into the foundation of your organization will help you gather the data that you need to make the changes that will transform your organization, your culture, into a space where folks have that sense of belonging. But if you don't have those things, you're not working on those things, you're not thinking about those things or seeing them as something separate or different or not important, you're not going to be able to get the data that helps you find the problems, the issues, the things that you need to fix. Because I know I've been in a space with the organization where, like, I'm not filling out this employee survey because y'all not going to do nothing with the data. Why am I spending 15 minutes doing this? Like, we've done this survey like 5 times. Please stop. Or I was in one organization, we found out that the senior leaders of the organization would get a roll up of their department specific, like, employee response data to the organizational survey, and there were some smaller teams. And I was like, I'm so glad that I was skeptical. And so I like wrote in not my voice. But that's what you get when you don't necessarily have a relationship. You don't have communication around what this is, where this is going to go. You have to be intentional about creating a culture that provides space for you to collect the data that you need to ensure that you're building an organization that has values and is able to operationalize principles around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah. I mean, if you're sitting there watching and thinking like, yeah, I know that trust is really easy to break and really hard to rebuild. That is true. But again, if you are in kind of like more of a collaborative frame, right, you're getting people from the organization to not only support your data gathering efforts, but to participate in it at a real level, right? Like, we are doing this to improve our situation. Then when there are mistakes, it becomes a lot easier to deal with it for several reasons. Like, one, if it's me and Octavia working on a thing and we make a mistake, I feel less bad because it's the two of us who made the mistake, right? But then also because we made the mistake, it's ours to fix. And that means that we just got to figure out how we're going to do that. It doesn't
Yeah.
all fall on one person. And I think
Mhm.
that's often a dynamic that we see that's a barrier to accomplishing this work. We end up feeling, for one reason or another, that it's all on me. It's all dependent on this other person. And these bottlenecks really don't have to exist, right? And frankly, that's kind of what we're trying to accomplish here with diversity, to make sure that there aren't so many bottlenecks, so many like weird concentrations of things, that there's a greater flow and exchange overall. So anything
That.
else, Octavia?
Yo, you just made me think about like the whole concept of collective ownership, collective accountability to the work. And like you said, if you have that foundation, it's not just one person. Everyone has some ownership, maybe even some excitement around, oh, I didn't know, my the LGBTQIA community was feeling this, or folks with kids were feeling this. Oh, we got to do something about that. There becomes a space where folks that have experienced some level of oppression or marginalization, they don't desire that for other folks. And so we're working together to collectively to ensure we have an understanding of how that feels. So how can I work together with another department, another pieces of organization to improve those outcomes? And it makes me think about how with all ACEs, in the organization I shared that example, they did not share the data responses with employees. They just shared it with the higher ups, who then tried to guess who did what responses. With all ACEs, we provide the data to the organization in an anonymized way. And we're like, share this organizational assessment report with your employees, one, so that they know that you saw this data and that there are some actionable things that were shared, through the organizational assessment report. Two, like, there's some shared ownership, accountability. People may have seen that they were the one that did the thing that someone may have elevated in a qualitative response. and it may spur them to change. And so this idea of ensuring that you're collecting data in an intentional way also comes to that the back end of that, as well as ensuring that you're sharing that data so that it really is helping you move towards building that diverse, equitable, inclusive organization and that transformation that you're seeking to do.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I'm hearing in that, Octavia, is like when people can share data transparently, when they can see that their efforts are making progress, um, that's something that feels good, and kind of fuels more buy-in, more desire to create positive change, and that's the kind of positive loop we want to be in. All
Yes.
right. Thank you so much, Octavia, for joining me on this Intentionally Act Live. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We will be back next month with another episode of Intentionally Act Live. Until then, this is Enrico E. Manalo with my colleague, Octavia Chambers, and we'll see you sometime down the road. Bye.
Hi.